So when we look out at our society and around the world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the huge problems we face. There's worldwide inequality and severe poverty, ecological destruction, constant war and threats of military conflict, racism and sexism, forced migration, homelessness, and so much more. Confronting any of these problems can seem like an enormous task, let alone all of them. But in fact, none of these issues are isolated. All of the major problems facing us today stem from the same source, the capitalist system. Capitalism is a global economic, social, and political system where a small minority owns and controls the vast majority of resources needed for survival. The purposes of this ownership is to make a profit and enrich the minority class of owners. The world's resources and labor are exploited, and wealth concentrates at the top among bankers, stockholders, and CEOs. These capitalists reinvest their wealth to expand their profits and run the political system in their favor. Workers create value through their labor, but any profits they generate are taken and controlled by the bosses. To maximize these profits, bosses do whatever they can to squeeze as much out of workers as possible. Whether through increasing work hours, keeping wages low, or intensifying the pace of labor, the goal of bosses is to exploit workers as much as they can get away with in order to boost profits. Under capitalism, bosses exploit workers to sell goods and services as commodities. The fundamental problems of our society are a result of this exploitation and commodification of all aspects of life. This means like basic necessities like housing, healthcare, and education are not guaranteed, but are turned into products that can be bought and sold. They are available only to those who can afford them, with devastating consequences for those who can't. This is why millions go homeless today. Property developers and landlords aim to maximize return, prioritizing high-end developments and expensive rental prices over affordable housing. This means that housing is distributed based on ability to pay rather than actual need. This leads to housing deprivation, unaffordable rent and home prices, and in the most extreme cases, homelessness. Under this brutal system, an estimated 150 million people worldwide are homeless. Capitalism not only forces millions on the streets, it leaves millions without access to quality and affordable health care. Under this system, healthcare providers, pharmaceutical companies, and insurance firms operate with the goal of cutting costs and optimizing profits. This means if you can't afford health insurance or the price of a medication, you may be forced to take on crippling medical debt just to survive, or otherwise forego treatment and risk death. It also leads to severe short staffing in healthcare facilities, putting immense pressure on overworked staff and endangering the health and safety of both patients and caregivers. This crisis turns every shift into a battleground, where the shortage of personnel threatens lives and pushes healthcare workers to their breaking point. Given this, it's no surprise that the biggest source of illness and death under capitalism is the stressful and strenuous environments in which we live and work. Consider a farm worker exposed to pesticides all day. This results in higher cancer rates. Or a bus driver who sits all day, leading to higher rates of obesity, back problems, and diabetes. The real problem isn't just cancer or diabetes, it's the exploitative and strenuous nature of work under capitalism itself. Addressing all these health issues would require dismantling capitalism, the root cause of these ailments. But that would be impossible within the capitalist system. So hospitals are built and planned around keeping the working population just well enough to keep working. Healthcare is typically built around treatment of symptoms, not root causes. And this is how we get the pharmaceutical industry, as most of us experience it. Similarly, the limitations of capitalism extend to other institutions in our society. For example, education under capitalism is not designed to develop the full potential of young people, but to prepare them for the workforce. Students are crammed into overcrowded, underfunded schools and subjected to a rigid curriculum designed to instill obedience and basic skills necessary for the capitalist economy. Essentially, it's a system that tells students to sit down and shut up, focusing more on maintaining order and preparing them to fit into the capitalist system rather than fostering their broader intellectual and personal growth. While a small fraction of the population might pursue higher education to fill specialized roles in science, technology, and administration, with about 2% globally achieving a bachelor's degree, the broader system remains focused on creating compliant workers rather than empowered individuals. Aside from the social problems arising from exploitation and commodification, another critical feature of capitalism is unemployment. Marx described unemployment as a structural aspect of capitalism, calling it the quote, reserve army of labor. Capitalists benefit from maintaining a quote, surplus population of unemployed or underemployed workers, which fosters competition among the working class for jobs. This competition helps keep wages low and labor conditions poor, as workers are more likely to accept exploitative conditions when jobs are scarce. It's not just that unemployment depresses wages and living standards. It's absurd that we operate under a system where a segment of the population desperately wants to work and contribute to society, but is systematically prevented from doing so, while at the same time everyone else is overworked. The issue of unemployment is linked to other societal problems, such as mass incarceration. As capitalism produces inequality and poverty through the exploitation of workers, it creates conditions where crime can become a desperate means of survival. In response, the state resorts to using the criminal justice and prison system as a dumping ground for the unemployed and surplus populations who are deemed unnecessary for the capitalist economy. Foundational to capitalism is also how it relies on and perpetuates systems of social oppression. Racist, sexist, and other discriminatory ideologies have historically been promoted by the ruling class in order to divide the working class and justify their dominance over society. Anti-Black racism in Europe and the United States, for example, emerged to justify the exploitation of African slaves and indigenous peoples during the colonial era and has remained a permanent feature of American society to this day. Similarly, sexism and gender-based violence are reinforced by the capitalist system. Bosses benefit from sowing divisions within the working class based on gender. This is evident in the systematic undervaluation of work performed by women. And more recently, we have seen growing attacks on LGBTQ plus communities across the country, driven by far-right Christian fundamentalist sections of the capitalist class. These ideologies are not just incidental, but are actively promoted and maintained by the ruling class to foster division among the majority and to preserve the ruling class's power. In all of these ways, capitalism thrives off of hatred and fear. This pattern of exploitation and division extends to the global stage. Capitalism not only undermines the immediate economic and social interests of workers, but it is also a destructive and violent system where war and military conflict arise from capitalist states competing for economic and political dominance. As capitalism develops, it tends towards monopoly, where dominant entities control vast amounts of power and resources. These monopolies are driven to expand beyond national borders, exploiting new resources, labor, and markets, an expansion known as imperialism. Capitalist governments, such as the United States, act in the interests of their national capitalist class, using military and economic power to exert control over other nations. This dynamic will be discussed in much more detail in our other video on imperialism and war. Capitalism doesn't just lead to war and military conflict. It is the relentless engine driving our climate crisis and ecological devastation. The obsession with profit and economic growth inherent in the system means that capitalism demands constant resource extraction and overproduction of goods. This all requires a lot of energy. And because our society is so dependent on fossil fuels and focused on short-term profits, we're racing towards ecological disaster. We can't stop using fossil fuels fast enough to prevent this collapse unless we change the system. This crucial issue will be explored in more detail in our video on capitalism and the ecological crisis. Confronted with these overwhelming and deeply entrenched issues, we must ask ourselves, what can we do to end this? Capitalism is a system built on the exploitation of the vast majority and fails to meet our needs. We cannot tolerate a system where a wealthy few hoard all the resources and power at our expense. We cannot accept a system that neglects our basic needs, drives us into violent conflicts, and ravages our planet. The stakes are too high, and the cost is too great to ignore any longer. Capitalists don't do the work that keeps society functioning, yet they wield all the power and control all the wealth. We are trapped in a system rigged against the majority of people, where those who contribute the least have the most power. This isn't a system that can be fixed with electoral reforms while leaving the fundamental structure intact and decision-making power in the hands of a privileged few. Given the extreme crises we face today across nearly every facet of our society, we must recognize that the system itself needs a complete transformation through revolution. We, the majority of society, must seize control of the wealth and the resources of society to collectively create a world that meets our needs. We must fight for socialism, a system where those who actually make society run hold the power and make decisions in the interests of the majority of the world's population. To grasp the urgency of this transformation, consider how we would respond if we lived under slavery. Would we settle for incremental reforms to improve conditions for slaves while allowing the slave economy and enslavers to maintain their power? Or would we recognize that the system is poisoned to the core and totally uproot it? Today, we must thoroughly examine how the symptoms we face are tied to the underlying disease of capitalism. Our task today is to end class society entirely. We don't have the luxury of addressing each problem individually. The entire system has to go. We must overthrow capitalism and end exploitation once and for all.